The city lay hushed beneath an amber sky, its bones of steel and glass jutting like the remains of a long-dead beast. Wind whispered through empty avenues, carrying the tang of scorched metal and old rain. Callen crouched low on the fractured ledge of a high-rise, the barrel of his rifle resting in a shallow groove worn smooth by weeks of waiting. He had learned the rhythm of the wind, the flicker of shadows on shattered walls, the way dust lifted in the wake of someone, moving below. Patience was not merely his ally, it was his currency. Through his scope, the distant movement sharpened into two figures. Tall, slender, and encased in segmented armor that caught the light in muted flashes, they moved with the controlled precision of trained scouts. Callen studied them as a biologist might study predators in a glass enclosure, respectful, calculating, without illusion. The one in the lead carried a long plasma carbine, his stride measured, his gaze constantly sweeping. The second followed half a pace behind, her posture lighter but eyes no less alert. Their kind had arrived months ago, their ships breaking orbit with all the subtlety of a hammer on glass. They had not come in force, not yet, but in small units like this one, searching, probing, testing the resilience of a planet still licking its wounds from other wars. The brass back home had named them the Vel'thari, but Callen preferred to think of them as exactly what they were, intelligent hunters convinced they sat atop the food chain. The mission parameters had been straightforward: eliminate scouts before they reported anything worth sending to their command. Simple in writing, far less so in practice. The Vel'thari had vision that cut through low light, senses that parsed sound from impossible distances, and technology that made most human tools look quaint. But they did not understand human camouflage. Not yet. Callen adjusted his ghillie hood, its tangle of synthetic fibers blending perfectly into the fractured concrete and moss at his back. His body was an extension of the ruin itself, heat's signature masked, movements measured in millimeters. He could wait for hours like this without a single muscle betraying him. Below, the scouts paused at the intersection of two debris-choked streets. The leader, taller and broader across the shoulders, raised a gloved hand in a silent signal. The female moved ahead, scanning the path with a device that hummed faintly in the still air. Callen could almost hear their conversation through their body language. Cautious, confident, certain of their superiority. His finger hovered lightly over the trigger. One shot here could cripple the patrol, maybe end it outright. But he had learned the value of timing, of letting the quarry step deeper into the snare before springing it. His orders were to gather behavioral data, as well as eliminate, and every extra moment they spent searching would teach him something about how they thought, how they reacted under the weight of unseen eyes. Relvia's voice came through her helmet comms, low and clipped. Sector clear. No thermal anomalies, no signs of habitation. Your instruments lie, Zarnek replied without turning his head. His voice was a rumble, dry as stone. This world breeds ghosts that don't burn hot enough to see until they are breathing on your neck. Relvia made a sound halfway between a scoff and a hum. Humans? Yes. And not just any. The one they call a sniper. The name was less a title and more a rumor among their ranks. The Vel'thari had lost patrols to a lone marksman in this region, always with the same pattern. No warning, no chatter, only the sharp punctuation of a single shot and then silence. Command considered it a nuisance. Zarnek considered it a problem worth solving. Callen could almost feel the weight of the alien suspicion, even from this distance. The leader's gaze swept the rooftops with deliberate slowness, lingering a fraction too long on certain angles. He was sharper than most. This hunt would not be a matter of plucking targets from the open. It would be a contest of patience and nerve. Wind shifted, brushing dust across the street and into the open plaza beyond. The scouts moved again, weaving through the skeletal remains of a collapsed transit hub. Callen tracked them, his breathing shallow, his pulse steady. They were heading toward a choke point, a corridor of tilted walls where cover was scarce. It was as good a place as any to start the dance. He inched his rifle into a new angle, keeping the scope's edge just inside the crumbling masonry that hid him. Through the reticle, Relvia's helmet glinted faintly. Her movements were efficient, economical, but she had the easy grace of someone who had never truly feared being hunted. That would change. Zarnek halted suddenly, one hand snapping up again. Rel'thari dropped low without question, scanning the upper levels. Callen stilled completely, letting even the thought of movement fade. The leader's gaze swept over his position once more, pausing just long enough to confirm that he knew, on some instinctive level, that danger lived there. But instinct was not proof, and proof was the only thing that made soldiers act. They pressed on, and Callen let them. His first shot would come when the leader had grown just comfortable enough to dismiss the itch between his shoulder blades. In war, overconfidence was the sharpest blade one could hand an enemy. The comms in Rel'thari's helmet clicked softly. 30 meters to the next extraction point, Zarnek said. We hold there and send report. Rel'thari nodded, her pace quickening slightly. The plaza narrowed into the corridor Callen had been waiting for, two leaning towers forming a jagged canyon. The ground was littered with twisted rebar and shattered glass. Every step they took made a faint, betraying crunch. Callen let them enter fully, then settled the crosshairs on Rel'thari's left knee joint. A disabling shot, not a kill, yet. His finger tightened on the trigger, and the rifle bucked with a muffled crack. The round struck true, armor splintering under its force. Rel'thari dropped with a startled hiss, her weapon clattering against the debris. Zarnek spun toward her, then toward the sound, his carbine already firing controlled bursts at the ledge Callen had vacated 2 heartbeats before. Callen was gone, slipping deeper into the labyrinth of ruined floors and stairwells. The echo of his shot still rolled through the buildings as he took up a new position. The hunt had begun in earnest now. Below, Rel'thari gritted her teeth against the pain, her eyes scanning wildly for a target she could not find. Zarnek crouched beside her, his voice low but sharp. He wants us to chase. We don't. We can't stay here, she hissed. No, he agreed, but we move on our terms. They began to fall back, slow and deliberate, scanning every angle. But Callen had already threaded himself into the city's veins, watching, waiting, guiding them step by step toward the place where the end would come. And somewhere in that silence, both hunter and hunted understood the truth. They were testing each other as much as they were fighting. When the light began to fade, the ruins seemed to draw closer, shadows thickening into the shapes of old predators. The first day of this game was done, but neither side intended to sleep. Callen had been lying in the same position for 17 hours. The muscles in his back burned, his elbows ached from the weight of the rifle, but his breathing was steady and shallow, controlled by long practice. Every few minutes, he shifted just enough to ease the cramp in a leg or hand, but never enough to change his silhouette. He knew from experience that even the smallest unnatural movement could betray a position, and the Vel'thari were not creatures you could afford to slip up against. His face was hidden beneath a hooded mesh of shredded fabric, dyed in streaks of gray and rust. From a distance, any distance, it was nothing more than another ragged scrap of the ruined building he occupied. His ghillie suit was layered with scavenged textures, insulation fibers, decayed rope, strips of weathered tarp, fragments of rebar netting. It wasn't beautiful, but beauty had no place in survival. The only measure of its worth was whether it kept him unseen. The rifle cradled in his hands was older than he was. It had passed from one sharpshooter to another, modified, repaired, patched, and wrapped until it no longer resembled the sleek, factory-born thing it once had been. It was stripped of anything that might reflect sunlight. Even the scope's glass had been dulled with a fine smear of dust and ash, enough to kill the shine, but not blur the image. He kept his cheek welded to the stock, one eye pressed to the scope, the other closed. Below, the alien scouts had entered his hunting ground. He had watched their landing from 2 kilometers away, then tracked their progress without once breaking cover. The Vel'thari moved like predators that had never been prey, confident in their armor, certain their scanners told the whole story. That arrogance was his ally. Callen had learned his craft from men and women who'd fought through the early years of the occupation. Back then, humans still tried to match alien tech with human tech, and they had died in swarms for the mistake. Electronic jammers, active camouflage, heat dampeners, all failed within weeks once the Vel'thari adapted. It was only when the survivors abandoned gadgets for the old ways that the kill ratios shifted. A sniper didn't need to blind a scanner if he never showed up on it in the first place. Camouflage, in Callen's world, wasn't just about sight. It was about sound, scent, and time. The aliens relied heavily on motion detection and heat contrast. He countered with patience, insulation, and control. Every breath was measured, every swallow planned. He ate sparingly before missions to keep his body's metabolic heat low. His heartbeat was as slow as sleep. The squad below paused in a plaza. He could hear faint vibrations through the beam under his chest when they shifted their weight. One of them scanned the rooftops, head tilting slightly, probably the leader. Callen didn't squeeze the trigger. Not yet. Firing wasn't about seeing a target. It was about seeing the right moment when distance, angle, and opportunity aligned into certainty. He watched them fan out. Their armor's shifting colors almost impressed him. The gradient changes were smooth, liquid, like oil flowing across water. But their very confidence in it made them predictable. They assumed they were invisible, so they moved in patterns meant for enemies who could see them. Callen wasn't looking for color shifts. He was watching for unnatural geometry, the curve of shoulder where rubble should be flat, the rhythm of motion where decay was still. One scout broke formation to check the base of a toppled comms tower. The movement exposed a sliver of unarmored neck between plates. Callen marked it mentally and tracked him until the alien returned to position. He thought briefly of his father, a resistance fighter who'd never lived to see the shift in tactics. The old man had believed victory would come from matching the invaders blow for blow. Callen had buried him in a crater with 37 others after a failed assault on a supply depot. That was the day Callen stopped dreaming of battles and started studying hunts. The Vel'thari were predators, but so were wolves, and wolves could be brought down by a patient trapper. All it took was learning their habits, anticipating their moves, and striking without warning. Through the scope, he saw the younger alien, taller, with the restless posture of inexperience, turn his head away from the leader, scanning without focus. That one will be first. Impulsive targets died easiest, and their panic scattered the survivors. Callen adjusted the rifle a fraction, the crosshairs settling just behind the helmet joint. Wind hissed faintly through the gaps in the wall around him. He read the drift from the sway of a hanging cable 20 meters away, adjusted his aim without looking away from the target. His finger rested against the trigger, applying only the lightest pressure, waiting for the alien to make the smallest mistake. It came when the scout leaned into the open, scanning upward. His body turned, exposing the gap fully, and for an instant, his helmet visor reflected a shard of weak sunlight. Callen exhaled and squeezed. The rifle coughed once, the sound swallowed by the wind and distance. Through the scope, he saw the alien jerk as if plucked by an invisible hand, then collapse sideways. The armor muted the fall, but the other two turned instantly, scanning with frantic speed. Callen didn't fire again. He slid his eye from the scope and flattened himself against the beam, rifle tucked close. Movement now would be suicide. Instead, he listened to the faint, distorted chatter from the Vel'thari as they argued in their own tongue. Their voices were tight, rapid. They didn't know where the shot had come from, and their scanning sweeps passed over his position without pause. He waited through 3 full sweeps before moving again. The rifle came back up, scope trained on the leader. This one was careful, methodical, keeping his profile low and visor sweeping in arcs. Callen noted the tension in the set of his shoulders, the subtle twitch in his mandibles when he paused. Fear was creeping in at the edges. Still, he didn't take the shot. 1 kill was disruption. 2 in quick succession might drive them to retreat too soon. No, better to let the fear deepen, to make them waste time and energy, to sap their confidence until the city itself seemed to close in around them. He shifted his aim to the third alien, who was moving between cover and short bursts, each time scanning behind rather than ahead. Inexperience again. The Vel'thari had better eyesight than humans, but even they couldn't see what wasn't moving. He tracked the alien's route, mapping the likely points where the line of sight would open fully. Beneath the slow churn of calculation, Callen felt a familiar calm. It wasn't joy. Killing wasn't something he celebrated, but it was a kind of satisfaction, the same a craftsman might take in a flawless cut. Every hunt was a test of discipline against the temptation to rush. The longer he waited, the greater the reward. The aliens regrouped at the far side of the plaza. The leader signaled something, and the remaining two shifted positions to cover opposite flanks. Callen followed the inexperienced one's movements again, noting that each sprint between cover grew a little longer, each pause a little shorter. Fatigue would set in soon. When it did, precision would falter. A faint vibration reached him through the beam, a tremor in the ground from the aliens' armored steps. It meant they were drawing closer to a street that offered him a clearer, longer shot. He let his breathing slow even further, fingers steady on the stock. Patience. Always patience. The city around him could have been frozen in time, nothing moving but the slow creep of dust in the air. When a younger alien finally stepped into the open, Callen didn't fire. Not yet. He let the moment stretch, memorizing the angles, the drift of the wind, the exact tension in his trigger finger. The leader's visor swept past his position again, still blind. He would wait until the panic reached the tipping point. Then, and only then, would he strike again. The plaza felt wrong now. Zarnek could sense it in the way the air seemed to tighten around them. How every creak of ruined metal sounded like a deliberate signal. The younger scout's body still lay crumpled in the dust, heat leaking away in a dim haze. The shot had been clean, too clean. No warning, no visible muzzle flash, no discernible trajectory. One heartbeat the soldier had been upright, the next he was gone. Vel'thari crouched beside the corpse, her mandibles tight. No plasma burn. Puncture wound through the neck joint. Projectile weapon, primitive caliber. Her tone was almost disbelief. Who fires solid rounds in this century? Someone who knows we can't trace them easily, Zarnek said, scanning the rooftops again. The shadows seemed thicker now, more deliberate. Our cloaks don't matter if the enemy isn't looking for light shifts. Torvek's absence was a void between them. His arrogance had evaporated with his life, leaving only the reminder that death here could arrive without sound. Vel'thari straightened, shifting her stance to cover their flanks. The plaza was a killing ground. Open center, multiple high vantage points. If the shooter had chosen this location, it was because it favored him. The leader's voice lowered to a growl. We move. Stay to cover. Don't stop scanning. They advanced toward a narrow alley choked with debris, each step measured. Zarnek kept his head moving, optics shifting through spectrums in rapid sequence. Still nothing. No heat spike, no movement signature. The alien mind struggled against a creeping thought. Perhaps the human wasn't moving at all. Halfway through the alley, something metallic pinged off a wall to their left. It was a tiny sound, almost lost in the wind, but it pulled Vel'thari's aim toward the rooftops. She fired a quick burst from her coil rifle, the charged rounds slicing into the upper stories. Glass and dust rained down, but no target fell. That was deliberate, she said. Zarnek agreed. It was misdirection, a lure to draw their aim while the shooter adjusted position. He had seen this kind of tactic in old war reports. Human snipers using ricochet and noise to make enemies waste ammunition. The fact that they were being manipulated at all gnawed at him. They cleared the alley and entered a courtyard. The buildings leaned in, casting long shadows that merged overhead. Every window was a black eye. Zarnek felt the urge to order a retreat, but he knew that giving ground in panic would only make them easier prey. A flicker of motion caught Vel'thari's eye, a shadow shifting high on the eastern wall. She fired again, but the shape dissolved into debris, and the sound of the shot seemed to echo from every direction at once. Zarnek caught a different movement, a length of wire swaying where there was no wind. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the second shot came. Vel'thari's body jerked as the round struck just below her left shoulder plate, punching through the thinner armor at the joint. She collapsed behind a fragment of wall, hissing in pain. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was enough to slow her. Zarnek dropped beside her, scanning the angles. The shooter hadn't taken the kill when it was offered. Instead, he'd gone for a disabling shot. That meant he wanted them off balance, forcing mistakes. "He's playing with us," Rel'Va said through clenched mandibles. "No," Zarnek corrected, "he's studying us." He left her in partial cover and moved to a position where he could watch the upper levels without exposing himself. A part of him wanted to call for extraction immediately, but the comms were unreliable here, the ruins blocking their signal. They would need to reach higher ground to transmit clearly, higher ground that would also expose them further. The courtyard was silent now, save for the faint scrape of debris under his feet. Even the wind seemed to have faded. Zarnek imagined a shooter somewhere above, eyes fixed through a scope, patient as stone. Humans had no natural cloaking, no advanced optics, yet somehow this one had made himself invisible. He thought of the images they'd mocked earlier, the crude nets and ragged coverings. The joke curdled in his mind. Perhaps this was what those images never captured. The stillness, the blending of body to ruin, the suppression of every telltale signal until the shooter was nothing more than another fragment of the city. Rel'Va's breathing grew shallow but controlled. She kept her rifle ready, her eyes scanning windows and ledges. Her earlier confidence had been stripped away, leaving a sharper, more calculating edge. "We can't find him," she said. "We don't need to," Zarnek replied. "We only need to move him." He fired 2 quick bursts into opposite corners of the rooftops, then immediately shifted position. The sound of impact rolled through the ruins, and somewhere in that noise, he thought he heard the faintest shuffle of fabric. Not much, but enough to tell him the sniper wasn't a phantom. They edged toward a stairwell that would take them up to a collapsed office floor. Higher elevation might give them a better read on angles, though it would also paint them as targets. Zarnek weighed the risk and decided it was better than being hunted on the ground. The stairwell smelled of rust and stale water. Each step groaned under their weight, announcing their ascent to any ears above. Rel'Va took the lead despite her injury, her rifle sweeping ahead. They reached the top and moved into the half-collapsed room. Through gaps in the wall, they could see across the plaza where Torvek had fallen. The view confirmed Zarnek's suspicion. There were a dozen viable sniper positions around that kill zone. A faint metallic click drew his gaze to the opposite building. For an instant, he thought he saw a sliver of cloth ripple against the stone. He brought his rifle up, but the image was already gone. Then another shot rang out, not at them, but at the wall beside Rel'Va. The round struck stone, sending fragments into her side. She hissed and dropped flat. The shot was a warning, or perhaps a test of their reactions. Zarnek's mandibles clenched. The sniper wasn't rushing. He could have killed her, but he'd chosen not to. This wasn't just a hunt. It was control, the predator dictating the pace. He scanned the horizon again, feeling the first true spark of unease. They weren't moving him at all. He was moving them, hurting them exactly where he wanted them to be. Rel'Va caught his eye. "If we stay, we die." He nodded once. They would need to break line of sight completely, vanish into the ruins until they could regroup. That meant retreating through the maze of lower streets, using the buildings as shields. They began to withdraw, moving fast but careful, keeping the shadows. Every now and then, a sound behind them, a rock falling, a faint scrape, kept their nerves taut. Each time they froze, scanning, they found nothing. But the knowledge was there, heavy as a hand on the back of the neck. The sniper was following. By the time they reached the edge of the sector, Rel'Va's pace had slowed. The wound was draining her strength. Zarnek knew they couldn't keep this up much longer without making a fatal mistake. He considered sending her ahead while he held position, but he suspected the sniper would predict that too. A soft, deliberate clang echoed from somewhere above, like metal settling, but in a pattern too clean to be accidental. Zarnek didn't even look up. The sound was meant to draw his gaze. Instead, he kept moving, forcing his instincts into discipline. The last alley before the safer zone was narrow, lined with rusted pipes and leaning walls. As they entered, Zarnek's gut tightened. This was a choke point, perfect for an ambush. Halfway through, a piece of brick fell from above, shattering on the ground ahead of them. Rel'Va froze. Zarnek raised his weapon, but there was no second shot, no movement, just the quiet certainty that they were still inside his crosshairs. They cleared the alley without incident, but Zarnek knew this wasn't over. The sniper hadn't missed. He had simply let them go, for now. Somewhere behind them, a human lay hidden in the ruins, already anticipating their next move. The hunt, Zarnek realized, was not in their control at all, and the worst part was knowing the human knew it. Relvia's breathing had grown ragged, a faint rasp echoing inside her helmet. The wound in her shoulder oozed dark fluid that slicked the edge of her armor, each step pulling a shiver through her frame. Zarnek kept one arm ready to steady her, but never slowed his own scan of their surroundings. The sniper's silence was a presence all its own, stretching across every empty street and shadowed corner. They were not escaping him. They were simply moving deeper into the path he had chosen. The comm channel crackled, faint and broken. Zarnek tried transmitting a priority code to the orbiting vessel, but the ruins swallowed the signal before it could stabilize. He cursed in his native tongue, a low, guttural sound. Without air support, their odds of survival dropped into fractions. Relvia's mandibles tightened. He could have killed us already. Why hasn't he? Because he's patient, Zarnek said. Patience is a weapon, and he's sharpening it on us. They reached a crumbling stairwell leading into the underworks of a collapsed commercial block. The darkness below was thick, damp, and heavy with the scent of mold and corroded metal. Zarnek motioned for them to descend. Inside, the narrow corridors muffled the wind, replacing it with the constant drip of unseen water. For the first time in hours, there was no vantage point for the sniper to exploit. They moved through the maze of concrete supports, past skeletal escalators and rotting signage. Zarnek's mind replayed the earlier shots in perfect clarity, the precision, the timing, the restraint. Whoever this human was, he had been trained by masters who understood that a sniper's truest weapon was control over the battlefield's tempo. A faint vibration shivered through the floor. Not footsteps, too dispersed for that. It was the thrum of distant impacts, perhaps structural shifts. Zarnek slowed, realizing the sound was following them, moving when they moved. The human was tracking them even without line of sight. Relvia leaned against a pillar, catching her breath. Her visor's glow cast thin light across her mandibles, and in that glow Zarnek saw something shift in her expression. Not fear, exactly, but an understanding that they had become the hunted in a war they thought they owned. "We need height," he said. "The only way to transmit a distress call is to breach the upper levels again. We'll make him work to hold position." Relvia's laugh was bitter. "And climb right into his range." "Yes," Zarnek answered, "but this time on our terms." They navigated upward through the wreckage, each step measured to avoid loose rubble. The ascent was slow, giving the sniper ample time to adjust, but there was no other path. At the top, they emerged into a shattered office floor with one intact wall overlooking the central sector. The light outside was dimming, the ash-filled sky bleeding toward dusk. Callen lay in the ruins opposite, exactly where he had been for hours. The aliens had moved as he'd anticipated, their patterns bending unconsciously toward the kill zone he'd mapped in his mind before the hunt even began. Through the scope, he watched them appear in the frame, their armor catching the fading light. The wounded one favored her left side now, slower, more deliberate, but still capable of returning fire. The leader's posture was taut, every motion deliberate. He respected that discipline. Most soldiers in their situation would have panicked by now. These two had adapted, slightly, but not enough. They were still thinking in terms of closing distance, of chasing or being chased. Callen wasn't in either of those games. The crosshairs rested on the wounded alien's visor. He could enter here, but there was a certain clarity in letting the leader watch first. Fear that was personal carved deeper than fear that was shared. Zarnek felt the hairline crack of awareness in his instincts, the subtle tightening that came a moment before danger struck. He shoved Relvia sideways, just as a round punched through the pillar where her head had been. The sound was soft, but its effect immediate. He dragged her behind cover, scanning the angles. The shot had come from across the sector. Perfect alignment through two collapsed walls. He's far, Relvier hissed, but not far enough. They returned fire in quick bursts, tearing through the ruin opposite. Dust billowed into the air, shrouding the line of sight. For a few breaths, there was nothing but the sound of settling debris. Callen waited in that silence, letting them burn energy and ammunition. When the dust began to thin, he adjusted slightly, bringing the crosshairs back onto the leader. Through the scope, he could see the faint gleam of alien eyes behind the visor glass. He steadied his breathing, counting the beats. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of ash and metal. Callen exhaled halfway, then squeezed the trigger. Zarnak felt the round strike his shoulder plate, spinning him halfway around. The impact didn't breach the armor, but it sent a jolt through his arm and jarred his weapon from his grip. He dove back into cover, adrenaline flooding his system. The sniper wasn't just aiming to kill now. He was cutting away their options, forcing them to stay pinned. Relvier crawled to his side, her weapon still in hand. "We can't outshoot him." "No," Zarnak said, retrieving his rifle. "But we can make him relocate." They began firing in staggered patterns, one suppressing while the other moved. Their shots weren't random. They were collapsing the space around the sniper's likely position, forcing him to shift or be cornered. Callen saw the change in their tactics. Smart. Dangerous. He slid back from the firing slit, moving through the skeletal frame of the building. His boots made no sound on the debris. Every path had been cleared during his approach. Within seconds, he had a new vantage point, higher and slightly offset from his original line. Through the scope, the aliens were still firing on his former perch. He let them, adjusting the crosshairs to the narrow gap where the leader would have to move next. Zarnak signaled for Relvier to cover him. He sprinted for the next piece of cover, and the world snapped into a moment of pure clarity. The soundless instant when predator and prey both understood what came next. Callen fired. The round pierced the leader's thigh armor, spinning him down hard onto one knee. Pain flared through Zarnak's leg, sharp and hot. He rolled behind cover before the second shot came, his breath hissing between clenched mandibles. Relvier's return fire was wild, more to shield him than a hit. But in that wildness was a truth neither of them wanted to voice. They would not make it out together. Zarnak dragged himself upright, leaning hard on the wall. "Go," he ordered. Relvier shook her head. "We both go, or neither does." Callen watched the exchange through the scope, his finger resting on the trigger, but unmoving. There was no rush now. He had time. The kill was certain. Above, the sky deepened toward full dark. The light would be gone soon, and with it the day's hunt. Callen shifted his aim one last time, centering on the leader's chest plate. A single squeeze would finish it. Yet something in the way the two aliens braced together, refusing to abandon the other, stilled his hand for a breath longer than necessary. It was enough for the wind to rise, rattling loose debris and scattering fine dust into his scope's view. He blinked, adjusted, and the moment returned to him. The shot cracked, echoing faintly in the ruin. Zarnak jerked once, then stilled, his body slumping against the wall. Relvier's cry was short, sharp, and cut off as she threw herself over him. Callen lowered the rifle. The hunt was over. He slid back from the wall, gathering his gear. Already the night was swallowing the city, and in darkness, even a sniper could become prey. He moved silently through the rubble, disappearing as easily as he had appeared. Far above, the first stars fought through the haze. In orbit, Vel'thari Command received the faint, intermittent ping of a life signal. One survivor, wounded, crawling toward extraction. And with it, an attached note in the threat assessment file. Human camouflage, effective. Recommend caution. Callen's voice, low and almost amused, broke the silence of his retreat. "My camo," he murmured to no one, "is death."